So we got a lot of questions, a lot. They kind of all came in right at the end as well. So we apologize if we can't get to all of your questions. However, I do want to let you know, and I'll remind you again at the end of this, we are going to do a brief follow-up where Anuja has agreed to answer a few more of your questions on Clubhouse. That'll be tomorrow at 3:30 Eastern, 12:30 Pacific. Keep an eye on our Twitter account for more updates on that. But let's go ahead and jump right in. And I want to start sort of high level and kind of talk about AV technology at a sort of high systems level, and then we'll sort of get down into some of the more detailed questions that we received about specific parts of it. Anuja, we have a question from Charlton that asks, full autonomous driving is highly complex and people are somewhat concerned about the technology. Can you suggest a path forward towards full autonomy and at the same time provide confidence in the technology? And this is a variation of a question we get sort of all the time, which is, essentially, how is it that people can stand confidence in this technology, given that it's so complicated?
I think it's a great question. It's a great place to start, high level generically. Fully autonomous driving is very complex, and it's really a very big ODD. And people are rightly concerned about the technology, as are the makers, because it's a very difficult challenge and a problem to solve. I think the approach that the industry has taken, though, to go into vertical silos, to pick an application area and to create structured solutions in those areas, I think that's the right approach. To be able to slice the fully autonomous landscape into areas that are commercializable, into areas that people can actually experience, and perfecting those, allowing the public to actually get an opportunity to use those technologies in those capacities. I think that would go a long way in providing confidence in the technology. And that's the path forward, is to start smaller steps and go ahead beyond that. So it's about creating a positive user experience for the users. And also it's very important to gain the trust of those who will interact with those vehicles on the road. And so, for example, that's why we focused our safety efforts on protecting pedestrians and on the road users outside of the vehicles, to creating a positive experience for the user of the technology, right? So, yeah. I can go on and on about this, but in a nutshell, I would describe it that way.
Yeah, and Oliver, I'd like your thoughts on this sort of general issue, but we had a question from Motional that kind of almost takes it one step further, and that is, what parameters would you use to construct an objective, repeatable test method to assess AV safety? What are your thoughts on that?
For sure. So, one of the things that I often get asked is around the role of regulators in self-driving cars. And a lot of folks, sometimes believe that regulation is holding up, the mass adoption of self-driving technology. And historically, that's just not been the case. The software and the hardware and the overall vehicle itself has been the lag in terms of, mass adoption. One thing I believe, though, is increasingly regulators will play a role in giving consumers that trust, right? That this is safe, that this is ready. And as of this moment, my feeling is that regulators don't quite yet, and I think this is the right call, know exactly the role they should play in giving a stamp of approval to the technology. But over, I don't know, the next 5 to 10 years, I think you'll increasingly start to see this become somewhat like the airline industry, where there is, if there are vehicles in the tens of thousands, autonomous vehicles across the country, you will start to see it be more regulated. And as a result, I think consumers will then gain more trust from not just seeing the technology and trying it, but also, those approvals from regulators will serve an important step there. I know Elon Musk likes to always make the argument that regulation is holding up, but anyway. And then on the question on creating repeatable tests to assess AV safety. So, our take on this is that when it comes to assessing the overall safety of these vehicles, the best place to start is human data, right? We've built up a wealth of data over many, many years of humans driving on the US roadways, on worldwide roadways. We know crashes, we know fatalities, we know all these gory details about how humans perform in certain environments at certain speeds. And we know all of this information. And, humans don't go through incredibly structured tests to assess their driving capabilities. People may think a driving test is structured, but it's somewhat is, but it's also unstructured in that it's the real world and you have an exposure to lots of things that can happen to you. And our general belief is that, and what I've seen that is quite optimistic, is the companies that are getting ready for driverless are making their case based on that human driving data. They're basically saying, we think we're better than superhuman. And as a result, no software is perfect. As we know, airlines still have issues, no hardware is perfect. But as long as they've exceeded that bar of human performance, you can make the argument that it is now in the public's interest to get this technology on the road because it will save lives as a result of being superhuman. So this is not a clear answer, but I guess what I'm saying here is that I'm not necessarily a huge believer that any sort of structured testing, which maybe isn't what the question is asking here, but I'm not necessarily a believer that any structured testing will get you that confidence that you are truly superhuman. You need exposure to all the things that humans are currently experiencing to make that claim.
Yeah. Anuja, one of the questions that we had is also sort of related to it, this with functional safety, critical in the auto industry, also important for autonomous vehicles, but Continental asks, is the present ISO 26262 standard sufficient for developing safe autonomous vehicles? You have some thoughts on that?
It's a great question, actually. So ISO 26262 is a functional safety standard, and it's the de facto standard that's being built and held towards. However, I think it's still important. It's important. It's sufficient to develop vehicles, safe vehicles. But when you add the autonomous component there, again, it depends. To answer it generically is difficult. Specifically, it depends on the level of automation, right, that you're adding there. For lower level automation, 1 and 2, it is sufficient. As you start increasing the level of autonomy and also the back and forth between, say, level 3, where there's a back and forth between the user and the autonomy, the standard may fall a little short because it is not absorbing that element in there. If you go higher up to level 4 and 5, where the vehicle is making autonomous independent decisions, in level 4 it's in a very tight ODD, in level 5 it's all the time. The standard does not really capture some of those decision making nuances in a way that can be tested in a deterministic manner. And so there's a SOTIF out there that is being discussed and talked about, which fundamentally it talks about how AVs will make decisions and roll that in, so that it will be parallel to 26262, but it is predominantly focused on AV decision making and how AVs will operate, and then redundancy, safety, and all that associated with that. I also think that cybersecurity is a very important aspect to develop safe vehicles, but also safe autonomous vehicles, which is not covered under 26262. So if you look at UNEC WP29 in Europe or ISO 21434, which is coming up in the United States, these standards are specifically focused on rolling in that cybersecurity component. And as we go forward 5 years ago versus now, and 5 years later, whatever, if you look at it, that cyber component becomes extremely important for connected vehicles, for connected automated vehicles. So short answer is, I think 26262 is still fundamentally extremely important and the one of the pillars, but not necessarily sufficient.
Yeah. So we have a question from Dan Hinkle, who it comes from the legal profession. And Oliver, I wanted to ask you one of his questions. He said, machine learning is often said to be inscrutable. Which systems, vision, driver, et cetera, use machine learning generated code, and how do AV developers deal with this issue in those systems?
Yes, so I often hear this, and often associate machine learning models with a black box, right? That cannot be inspected. It's making these decisions and you can't necessarily scrutinize them. I would say that, you know, if you rewound the clock maybe 5-6 years, that was the case. Mostly because the tooling wasn't really there to do so. And it wasn't because the models are mysterious and magical. It was simply a matter of being able to necessarily have the tooling. Now we fast forward 5 years to today, there's a really robust set of tools built around machine learning to inspect these models, both pre-deployment and post-deployment. And being able to measure the performance of these models, again, pre-deployment, and then inspect what the models actually performed like post-deployment, that's very much something that computer vision engineers today are able to do. Now, whether it's as you know, deterministic as other more classical methods is still something of a discussion topic. In terms of how we approach this problem, machine learning has proven to be far better performing in terms of computer vision than non-machine learned methods in being able to detect pedestrians, detect vehicles, all those sorts of things. But we, like hopefully any good developer does, expect every of our technology to fail at some point in some weird way, just because that's the way of the world. And if that thing fails or doesn't detect an object, for example, there is another layer that's there below that does not share any commonality between those two things. And that enables the autonomous vehicle to always safely detect objects, because there's always a second layer or third layer that doesn't have any commonality between them. So the short answer is that you can inspect machine learning models today. The tooling is quite mature to be able to do so. So they're not quite as black boxy as they used to be in the past.
Fascinating. Anuja, I wanted to ask you, sort of keeping in this sort of high level area before we kind of get a little bit more detailed here. What is your thinking about the metrics that can show progress in AV technology's path to readiness? Specifically, sort of what are the metrics that suggest, and I want to get Oliver's thoughts on this as well, actually, but specifically for making the step to driverless, you know, is there one metric that you can say, okay, we've crossed this line and therefore, you know, we're ready to go driverless, or do you need more than that? And what sort of are those metrics?
So again, this is a good question. Keeping it very high level, right? To determine whether, you know, an AV technology is mature enough and readiness, before we get to metrics, right? Maybe I'll just talk about goals. So we focus on goals and KPI-based approach, so that we are identifying, say, on a feature level or on a capability level or from a user's perspective level, right? You're identifying what is the goal, what are we trying to test here, and then you ask the right questions. So this method is called Goals Question Metric method, GQM. It was pioneered actually at the University of Maryland, and there's a method that NASA uses, and to send satellite communication devices that go out there. And once they're out there, you can't really ask these questions and gather the right metrics if you have not anticipated it beforehand. And so these systems have very long shelf lives, and you have to be thinking so much in advance about failures and things like that, right? So the key here is you ask the right question to determine, have you captured the essence of that feature in that question? And then you ask that goal, and then you ask the right questions. What are the questions that can be, if I answer these questions, satisfy that goal? And then from those questions, you determine what are the metrics that would be measured, that need to be, what are the metrics that need to be identified that answer that question. And then when you have the metrics, you say, okay, what are the set of measurements that actually point to satisfying this metric? So it's a very detail-oriented, convoluted process. But in that process, you would then create all kinds of scenarios. You identify, say, this is pedestrians, road users, vulnerable road users, localization, etc. You identify each of them, and then you build the scenarios that will actually test each one of those out, and then pick the metrics that then measure pass or fail, and how many times you take those measurements, right? So for example, we will take each scenario is run, a single test is run 10 times, and each test is run 10 times. So 100 times you have each scenario run. We have 935 scenarios just for, say, a vehicle coming out of a parking spot, and there are some movements around it, right? So for example, right? And then you're going to look at pass-fail rate on a per test level, and then extrapolate that up to a per scenario, per category, and so forth. So now you have failure rates associated with that can be tracked. And over time, as you find bugs, you find issues, go back to the development team, they fix that, you come back, redo the testing. Over time, you can see a trend like, is this improving? Is this getting better? Is this getting worse? And that's a measure of whether your metrics, those numbers, are supposed to go up or supposed to go down. Yeah. So that's really, how we attack the issue.
Awesome. Yeah, love the detail there. And Oliver, so you've done sort of some of your first driverless testing. Sort of what's your view on that and the metrics that sort of allow you to say, yes, we're ready to do this?
There's really two categories for us. There's safety and comfort, and we'll leave comfort for now. But that's including things like the number of hard brakes, the number of the time to destination versus a human, a lot of those sorts of things. When it comes to comfort, safety, and if we were to boil it down to a single yes or no answer to determine if we're ready for driverless, the question that's always on our mind is, does the vehicle stop for any obstacle that we care about, right? And answering that question is really difficult because it encapsulates a lot of different modules, but that's the question that we seek to answer. Can the vehicle stop for any obstacle that a human would stop for example? And tactically, that looks like our primary autonomous system, and then assuming that for whatever reason was to fail, you have your secondary autonomous system, a system that we call SHIELD internally. And SHIELD is effectively measured like an automatic emergency braking system internally. Again, how many false positive trigger events does it have, and how many false negative missed braking trigger events has it had? And the one we care most about is the false negative trigger. When should the vehicle have braked but didn't brake for whatever reason? False positive triggers are annoying, and in some cases a safety related issue because you might have a hard stop and a vehicle might rear end you. But for the most part, we think of those as more towards the comfort sort of angle. So for us, we know what the human rate of not stopping for an obstacle is. We've done that work internally to come up with that number across a statistically significant set of miles in similar speed zones that we're in and things like that. And then we have metrics internally to exceed those. And we have a team internally that monitors new drive data that comes in, assesses events, says if this was an issue or not an issue, and that leads towards our metric. Then as soon as we exceed that metric, then we're good to go.
All right. So I want to look at the perception side of things, and specifically the sensor hardware. Anuja, how people want to know, how do you ensure that your sensors will continue to operate when there's no one in the vehicle, and there's all kinds of mud and dirt and weather and bird poop and everything else that you find in the real world? How do you sort of make that perception system robust enough to withstand all that?
So number one, I think you can't avoid those kind of situations happening. Number two, the user, when you say experience of what the vehicle is doing and increasing public trust in the vehicle, it's not only important to see what the user of the vehicle and his experiences is, but also road users. With these vehicles, the goal is to blend them with other road users, not to disrupt traffic, to ensure that they can safely share the street with pedestrians and other road users. So when these vehicles will travel, and if there's a suboptimal, for example, one sensor is blocked, right? So we can measure that, and we know that the sensor is blocked. If that's a non-blocking sensor, what I call the non-blocking sensor is that means the vehicle's mission can continue uncompromised, and the quality of that mission to the outside users of that, outside the vehicle, the pedestrians and other road users, is uncompromised. That vehicle can continue on its mission. And if it is a blocking sensor or sufficient number of sensors, like if there's snow on all of the sensors outside the car, for example, in one side, and so all of them are blocked, then at that point, there is a prompt to the user that this vehicle will not engage in autonomous mode. And you, so basically you deny the user from being able to use that service at that point, because those capabilities cannot be exercised at a level that is expected for other road users and the consumer themselves. And then they have to clean their car, just like, whenever a car is dirty, you have snow on the windshield, you have to clean it so that you can use your vehicle. That's the one. Most of the sensors we use, though, are already protected, have a shield, have a covering, so they don't have this issue. But there are certain sensors, like the ultrasonic sensors or whatever, that will get occluded occasionally because of weather, dirt, and all these things. So right now, this generation of systems that we have built relies on the owner or the operator of that vehicle before they let the vehicle go remove. Clear that up. But the vehicle will tell them if there is a problem with the sensor. So we will do the job of telling you that this sensor is not up to standard, but you have to clean the sensor.
Yeah, absolutely. And Oliver, sticking with perception, how ready are AVs to interpret hand signals from flaggers, crossing guards, and law enforcement?
It's a great question. Computer vision is particularly adept at these things, right? So all computer vision really is doing is looking for patterns in data, images, point cloud, things like that. And turns out that when you're doing a hand signal, or a policeman's doing a hand signal, an AV is very well equipped to be able to interpret those sorts of signals. There is a limit to what it's able to reason. So, if a important person makes a signal in a road, then, it's able to understand, if this happens, then I should do that. If more complex scenarios happen, which maybe require eye contact, or I don't know, something that's very human, then an AV is still going to struggle to reason in real time. In fact, it's going to definitively struggle to reason in real time. But in terms of the structured sort of traffic signal is down and traffic cop is helping go through those situations, AV is pretty good at those things.
Yeah. Anuja, we have a question from Harvard. How do you take experience design into consideration when developing your path planning technology?
I think that's an excellent question. Experience design is catching on a lot. I think it makes most sense when you have a single stakeholder, like you have an app, and so the app design, the experience design is guiding you to create minimal friction for the user, most intuitive, not to have decision fatigue, etc., etc. But when it comes to AV technology in the consumer space, I'm not talking about the commercial space just yet, but if you're in the consumer space, you have multiple stakeholders, so it becomes very, very hard to create an experience design that is uniquely optimized to one stakeholder, right? Like I said before, it's not only about the experience of the owner who owns the car, who can trigger the vehicle to go park for itself and come back. But once you have let your car go, it's not important to you what speed the vehicle drives at. It's not important to you how long the car takes to park. It's not important to you, things like that, what route the car takes to get to the parking spot, or which spot exactly near or far it parked in. But it's very important to other road users and other pedestrians that the vehicle drives safely, it not create so much drift that people get scared who are walking just along the side of your vehicle, etc. So design that so at different points in the mission, right, different stakeholders' experience is maximized. So the model of the driver, the behavior is a cautious and considerate driver. So having low speed operating zones, low slowdown regions, etc., things like that, so that people, if a pedestrian is walking by your car is not stopping, going, but understand that this person is not crossing my path, they're walking beside me. But you still clear the slowdown regions, you're slowing down so that the pedestrian can continue to walk side by side with your car without feeling threatened that, oh, I'm going to get sucked in, this car is driving so fast. Or if a pedestrian crosses your vehicle, then now you stop and let them cross, and courtesy. So things like that. So it is all taken into consideration, but again, we are balancing that against who is the stakeholder for whom this is maximized.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're almost out of time, but I wanted to get one more question in for Oliver before we go. By the way, if you do have to leave now, if you can check us out on Clubhouse at 3:30 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, 12:30 Pacific. We will be taking some more of the unanswered questions from this session, and Anuja has very kindly volunteered her time to answer more of those. So Oliver, while we still have you, before you go, where do you see, this is a question that we got verbatim here, where do you see the greatest source of instability right now, and that's in quotes, instability, regarding the hardware and software of the AV stack, and how do you see that being mitigated? And what would be number two behind that? Maybe also if you could just explain what is meant here by instability for those who don't know.
It's a great question. So when it comes to instability, I would assume what the question is getting at is potential safety issues between the hardware and the software. I think one of the undervalued hooks that autonomous vehicles need to perfect is the hook into the vehicle itself. And when it comes to integrating into a vehicle, what that really means for the most AV developers is you're partnering with an automaker who's providing you a solution, and you are then plugging in your hardware and your software into this vehicle. And there's an inherent trust that has to appear between those two things, because someone didn't build the car and the car maker didn't build the hardware and the software. And is a lot of automakers are taking it really seriously that they should build autonomous ready vehicles. And what that really means is that to integrate self-driving technology into a vehicle is very different architecturally than if you were to have a human behind the wheel. You need redundancy in many different areas, redundancy in braking, redundancy in steering. You need validated integration points into the vehicle. Gone are the days of reverse engineering cars and hacking the CAN bus and those sorts of things. So that's the link that I believe is very important. And what I would say today in terms of autonomous vehicles is that although there's a lot of activity going on with automakers building these versions, there just isn't that many versions of these vehicles out there to buy. So some people are making bets on vehicles that aren't quite as mature as others in terms of their integration levels, and this is going to be an evolving piece of the puzzle. But anyway, I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but in terms of the hardware software instability, I think I wouldn't call it instability, but the biggest question mark looms over the software and the hardware's integration into the vehicle, not necessarily the link between the self-driving technology's hardware or software.
I second that wholeheartedly. I think Oliver is exactly correct. I think the base layer of the AV stack that interfaces with the vehicle is one potential source of uncertainty if it's not done correctly either in cooperation with the OEMs, or you really know how to interact and work with these drive-by-wire systems, right? So that's one definite layer there. I think the second one is probably, and I would say this, I would not classify this as just the hardware and software of the AV stack. I would put three things on the table: hardware, software, and system level. So anything that's not hardware and software falls, like, it's called the glue in between. So it can be the network, it can be the comms, it can be all the external communication, etc. And that's just as critical as the hardware and software itself. So from my experience, I've seen the software is rock solid. It is very, very robust. You go through multiple rapid cycles of iteration, bug finding, fixing, and on your software. Hardware is slower, it trails, because again, hardware iterations are traditionally slower than software. But you also have the communication. So even the external communication over, if you take your vehicle and draw a line on the outline of the vehicle, anything that's outside that outline, we call the attack surface, is also a potential source of instability, because the vehicle is inherently trusting what is coming out from the outside to the inside. And it's making decisions based on that. So anytime you're not relying on your own sensors and your own information that you are collecting by yourself with your eyes and your ears, but you're relying on something else giving you, there is a source of instability there. So that is also extremely important.
Absolutely. And just really quick before we go, just quickest answer you possibly can give to this question from Embitel Tech. How should an engineer start learning about ADAS and AV for upskilling? Oliver, you want to start?
For sure. So Udacity, the online education startup, has a ton of great content, not just around self-driving cars, but robotics and computer vision and things like that. Personally, if I was to get into this industry today, on the engineering side, I would focus on the problem of prediction. I think it's one of the most fascinating problems. It's an inherent roadblock for large-scale deployments of these vehicles into dense urban environments. And prediction is one of those areas that just doesn't have the same massive, same numbers as areas like computer vision, for example. So there's tons of great resources out there. Read papers, there's tons of online classes, all these sorts of things.
Great. And Anuja?
And I would say SAE is a great source because SAE has Mobilis. It's a platform for online e-learning, and there are tons of courses and material available there. I would also say that a free option is you can join a lot of the standards meeting working groups, going down into not the standards committee, but each standard committee has working groups, and they've identified core problems, core areas that they want to focus on. Join those, get your hands dirty, roll up your sleeves, and all it requires is your time. And there are lots of people there who can mentor you, you can learn from them, and you can contribute back also. That's a great place also to learn. And the third thing is just get your hands dirty. You can start building. There are so many programs out there where you can actually, even on YouTube, you can see them. Talk to AV companies. We are more than happy to talk to people who are interested in this field and want to learn. And we have, mentorship programs for them also. But, to get your hands dirty, start using these systems. And developing for them, right? We can expose APIs and all that, and people can actually get a small base layer and actually make their own experiments and run things on in a VM, right? So not on a car. But I would say that those are great starting points, especially for engineers, eager.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've gone over, but we still have many questions that you submitted left unanswered. We will do our best to address as many of those as we can tomorrow at 3:30 Eastern, 12:30 Pacific, when Anuja will be joining us on Clubhouse. This is PAVE's first, I think, room in Clubhouse. So we're really excited for that and for more of those to come. So in the meantime, thank you so much to both of our guests, Oliver Cameron of Voyage and Anuja Sonalker of Steer. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. And we will see you here again next week for the next PAVE virtual discussion.